The handcuffs clicked around my wrists at exactly 0847 hours, right as General Franklin was asking me about the Taliban intercepts. "Enough of this charade, Zara." Marcus's voice cut through my secure briefing like a blade. "You're faking being an officer. Hands behind your back." On my laptop screen, 4 Pentagon generals froze mid-sentence. General Franklin's weathered face hardened as he watched my stepfather burst into frame handcuffs, gleaming in his grip like a badge of authority he no longer carried. "I've spent 30 years in law enforcement," Marcus continued, his retired police captain voice filling every corner of my home office. "I know stolen valor when I see it. Real Army officers don't run top-secret briefings from their dining room." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had built his entire identity around being the authority in any room, the one who knew better, the one who solved problems others couldn't see. Now he stood behind me, convinced he was exposing the greatest fraud of his career. I muted my microphone with my chin, keeping my voice steady, despite the metal biting into my wrists. "Protocol breach in progress, stand by." General Franklin leaned forward on screen, his Joint Chief's pin catching the light. "Colonel Carter, are you compromised?" The word colonel hit Marcus like a physical blow. His grip on my shoulder tightened, confusion flickering across his face for just a moment before hardening back into conviction. "Colonel," he spat. "She told us she pushes papers for supply logistics. I've got recordings of her calls, contact lists with fake general names equipment that belongs in Hollywood, not the Army." Behind him, I could see my carefully constructed evidence file scattered across the coffee table where he'd left it. Surveillance photos of my daily routines, transcripts of conversations he'd recorded from outside my office door, detailed logs of my phone calls and internet activity. For 2 weeks, he'd been building his case like the methodical investigator he'd once been. My foot found the panic button beneath my desk, a small red device that base security had installed when they learned I'd be conducting classified briefings from home. The button connected directly to the base operations center, triggering immediate response protocols for officer safety emergencies. Within seconds, Fort Richardson's automated security alert triggered across the base. Emergency lights began flashing at the main gate. Security teams received immediate notification. The base commander's phone started ringing. The sound of sirens filled the air outside our officer housing unit, not distant sirens from the main base, but close, immediate, urgent sirens coming directly toward our street. Marcus's face twisted into a satisfied sneer. "Nice theater setup, Zara. You even got fake sirens? How much did this whole production cost? How long have you been planning this con?" Then came the pounding on our front door. Not the polite knock of delivery drivers or neighbors, but the authoritative hammering of law enforcement who meant business. Military police open immediately. For the first time since he'd burst into my office, I saw doubt flicker across Marcus's face. Real doubt. The kind that creeps in when your certainty starts cracking at the edges. But he pushed it down, clinging to his narrative like a life preserver. "They're probably in on it," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Or you called in a false emergency to sell the story." Through the window, I could see multiple vehicles arriving, not just one patrol car, but a coordinated response. MP vehicles, a base security sedan, emergency lights flashing in patterns that indicated this was being treated as a serious incident. What Marcus didn't know was that those fake sirens belonged to the real MPs who'd been protecting me for 3 years, and they were about to show him exactly how real my authority was. But to understand how we got here, you need to know about the lie I'd been living for 15 years. Not about being in the Army. That was obvious from our house and officer family housing, from the base stickers on my car, from the ACU uniforms hanging in my closet. But about what I actually did in the Army. See, when your job involves briefing generals about terrorist threats, designing counterintelligence protocols, and coordinating operations that could start or stop wars, you learn to compartmentalize. You learn to separate the person who sits at the dinner table from the officer who sits in the Pentagon. The compartmentalization started early in my career, back when I was a young lieutenant assigned to my first intelligence unit. My commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Williams, had pulled me aside after my initial security briefing. "Carter," she'd said, You're going to learn things that will keep you awake at night. You're going to prevent attacks that will never make the news. You're going to save lives that will never know your name. And you're going to do it all in silence." She'd been right. Over 15 years, I'd learned to live 2 lives with surgical precision. During family dinners, when Marcus would ask about my work with that particular tone that suggested he was testing me, probing for inconsistencies in my story, I'd smile and say, "Just pushing papers for supply chain management, making sure boots get to the right bases, MREs get to the right units, that kind of thing. Nothing exciting." When encrypted calls came in at 0300, and they came often because threats don't respect time zones, I'd tell them it was inventory coordination with overseas bases. You know how it is with time differences. When it's morning in Afghanistan, it's the middle of the night here. When I disappeared for days on what I called business trips, I'd return with carefully crafted stories about boring logistics conferences in D.C. or supply chain management seminars. I'd bring back conference materials I'd printed from the internet hotel keycards, from places I'd never stayed, business cards from people I'd never met. The truth, those 3 a.m. calls were emergency briefings about developing threats in Afghanistan, coordinated strikes against terrorist networks, intelligence reports that determined whether American convoys would be attacked the next day. Those trips were classified missions to military installations across 3 continents: Germany for NATO intelligence coordination, South Korea for threat assessments about North Korean capabilities, Qatar for Middle Eastern operations planning. Those papers I pushed were intelligence reports that crossed the desks of 3-star generals, threat assessments that influenced presidential briefings, operational plans that saved American lives in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. But I'd learned early in my career that operational security wasn't just about protecting classified information from foreign adversaries. Sometimes it was about protecting your family from the weight of what you carried from the knowledge that your daughter spent her days preventing terrorist attacks and her nights coordinating responses to imminent threats. Marcus, however, had been watching. Building a case. Applying 30 years of police investigative skills to what he saw as the most elaborate con he'd ever encountered. It started 6 months ago when he noticed patterns that didn't make sense for a supply logistics officer. The encrypted laptop that never left my side, even at home. The secure phone that rang at odd hours with calls I always took privately. The way I deflected questions about work, with the smooth precision of someone who'd practiced those deflections 1,000 times. "What kind of supply clerk needs that level of computer security?" he'd asked my mother one evening, gesturing toward my laptop with its biometric locks and encrypted hard drives. Then he'd started listening. Not obviously. Marcus was too smart for that. But he'd developed a habit of walking past my office door during calls, pausing just long enough to catch fragments of conversation. He'd heard me use terms like operational security, threat assessment, actionable intelligence, and classified briefing, language that seemed far too sophisticated for someone who supposedly managed inventory spreadsheets. He'd found my contact lists during one of his accidental glimpses at my phone filled with names like General Morrison, Admiral Chen, Secretary Williams, and Director Thompson. To his experienced eye, these looked like the kind of fake contacts a con artist would create to impress people. Too many high-ranking officials for a simple logistics officer to know personally. He'd photographed my equipment when I was in the shower or getting coffee, encrypted phones that cost more than most people's cars, secured laptops with government property tags, biometric authentication devices that looked like something from a spy movie. All of it far too expensive and sophisticated for a simple logistics officer. 2 weeks ago, his suspicions had crystallized into action. He'd started keeping detailed logs of my activities, when I received calls, how long they lasted, what I said when I returned to family conversations. He'd begun recording my side of phone conversations from outside my office door, transcribing military terminology that sounded fake to his civilian ears. "Everything points to fraud," he'd told my mother just yesterday, showing her his evidence file like a detective presenting a case to a prosecutor. "She's been lying to us for years, Evelyn, building this elaborate story about being more important than she is. I've seen this before. Stolen valor cases where people create entire fake military careers. The file was thick. Dozens of pages of surveillance notes, photographs of equipment, transcripts of conversations, analysis of patterns that he interpreted as evidence of deception. My mother, bless her, had tried to defend me. Richard, she graduated from West Point. She's been in the Army for 15 years. We live on base in officer housing. That's what makes it so sophisticated. Marcus had insisted his cop instincts in full detective mode. She got into the military legitimately, but now she's exaggerating her role, her rank, her importance. She's probably using her basic military credentials to build this elaborate fantasy. Maybe for money, maybe for respect, maybe just because she can't handle being ordinary. He'd shown my mother transcripts of conversations where I'd used phrases like briefing the Joint Chiefs and classified operations in Afghanistan. To him, these were obvious fabrications. No real logistics officer would have access to that level of information. Real military officers don't act this secretive about routine work, he'd argued. Real supply clerks don't get calls from generals. Real logistics personnel don't have equipment that costs more than my car. She's living in a fantasy, and I'm going to wake her up. So when he burst into my office this morning and saw me apparently conducting a top-secret briefing with fake generals on my computer, it confirmed everything he'd suspected. He was saving our family from a sophisticated con artist who happened to be his stepdaughter. My mother, Evelyn, appeared in the hallway, her nurse's scrubs still on from her overnight shift at the VA hospital. After 12 hours of caring for wounded veterans, she looked tired in the way that only healthcare workers understand. Physically exhausted, but mentally sharp, ready to handle whatever crisis had brought sirens to our quiet neighborhood. The sound of multiple vehicles screeching to a halt outside, not one or two, but several, made her face go pale. She'd spent enough time around military families to know that this level of response meant something serious was happening. "Richard, those are real MPs," she whispered, using his given name instead of the honey or babe she usually called him. She only used his full name when she was scared or angry, and right now she was both. "What did you do?" Through our front window we could see them. 4 military police officers in full tactical gear, emerging from 2 MP vehicles, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that only comes from real training and real authority. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led the team, his hand resting casually on his weapon as he assessed the situation. Behind the MPs, a base security sedan arrived with additional personnel. This wasn't a routine domestic disturbance call. This was a coordinated response to what the base was treating as a potential security incident involving a high-ranking officer. "They're probably in on it," Marcus insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "Military bases have protocols for this kind of thing, or she called in a false emergency to make her story look real." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping in. Real MPs don't respond to fake emergencies. Real MPs don't risk their careers participating in elaborate hoaxes, and the speed of their response, less than 3 minutes from alert to arrival, suggested this was exactly the kind of emergency they'd been trained to handle. My mother watched through the window as more vehicles arrived. Not random responses, but coordinated support. Base security. Criminal Investigation Division. Even a sedan that she recognized as belonging to senior base leadership. "Richard," she said quietly, "this is real. These are real soldiers responding to a real emergency. What did you do to Zara?" The front door of our housing unit burst open with the controlled force of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The MPs had received authorization to enter from base operations, standard protocol when an officer's safety was potentially compromised. "Ma'am, we received a code red from your location." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced, his weapon holstered, but his hand resting casually near it. His eyes quickly assessed the situation. Me in handcuffs at my desk, Marcus standing over me with the bearing of someone who thought he was in control. My laptop still displaying classified briefing materials that he probably couldn't read or understand. Rodriguez was a 12-year veteran who'd served 3 tours overseas before being assigned to base security. He'd responded to domestic disturbances, break-ins, and security breaches. But this was different. This was an officer, and not just any officer, under apparent duress during a classified operation. The MP team spread out professionally, securing the room while maintaining visual contact with all parties. Corporal Zhang moved to secure my laptop and any classified materials. Private First Class Thompson positioned himself near the window with a clear view of both the room and potential external threats. Specialist Garcia remained near the door, ready to coordinate with additional responding units. "Sir, step away from the colonel immediately." The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Marcus blinked hard, his entire worldview starting to crack. "Colonel, she told us she's supply logistics. She pushes papers. Look at my evidence. I've got recordings, surveillance photos, equipment analysis. She's been running an elaborate con—" Rodriguez's expression shifted to something between confusion and professional alarm. He'd been briefed on every officer on base, knew their roles, their clearance levels, their importance to base operations. Colonel Zara Carter wasn't just another officer. She was their intelligence director, someone whose security was a matter of national importance. "Sir, that's Colonel Zara Carter, our intelligence director," Rodriguez said, his tone shifting from routine response to something much more serious. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus looked around the room, frantically pointing to his evidence file on the coffee table. "Look at the surveillance. Look at the recordings. I've been investigating this for weeks. She's pretending to be more important than she is." Rodriguez keyed his radio with practiced efficiency. "Base, we have Colonel Carter secured civilian in custody for questioning. Requesting CID response and immediate security sweep. Potential compromise of classified briefing in progress." The response came back immediately from the base operations center. "Confirmed. Colonel Carter holds TS/SCI with SAP access. Treat as potential espionage incident until cleared. CID en route, base commander notified." Marcus's world began to crack in earnest. What does that even mean? What's TS/SCI? What's SAP access? "Top secret with special access programs, sir," Rodriguez explained, his tone professional but cold. "Colonel Carter has security clearance that requires congressional approval. She briefs generals on classified operations that protect American lives overseas." I watched my stepfather's face as the reality started to penetrate. The MPs weren't treating me like a fraud they'd caught in the act. They were treating me like exactly what I was, their superior officer, someone whose safety and security were their direct responsibility. "This has to be a mistake," Marcus said, his voice smaller now. "She told us she manages supply chains. She said she pushes paperwork." "Sir," Rodriguez replied, "Colonel Carter's operational security requirements prohibit discussion of her actual duties with unauthorized personnel. What you interpreted as deception was classified protocol." Through the window, more vehicles were arriving. Not chaos, but coordinated response. Additional MP units to secure the perimeter. CID investigators to assess potential security breaches. Base leadership to manage what was shaping up to be a significant incident. But the real shock was still coming. The sound of another vehicle arriving made everyone turn toward the window. Through the glass, I could see a black sedan with government plates and base commander flags. Transportation reserved for only the highest-ranking officers on Fort Richardson. Colonel Hayes, our base commander, stepped through the doorway with the bearing of someone who'd commanded respect for 30 years. At 6'2", with silver hair and 3 rows of ribbons on his dress uniform, he filled the room with an authority that made even the MPs straighten their posture. Colonel Hayes had commanded bases in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Germany. He'd briefed congressional committees on military readiness and advised Pentagon leadership on strategic operations. When he spoke, people listened, not just because of his rank, but because of his reputation for competence and integrity. Every MP in the room snapped to attention. Even with handcuffs on, they positioned themselves protectively around me, creating a barrier between their superior officer and the civilian who'd apparently attacked her. "Sir," Colonel Hayes said to Marcus, his voice carrying the weight of absolute military authority, "you've just detained my deputy intelligence commander during a classified Pentagon briefing." Marcus looked around the room. at the MPs standing at rigid attention at the respect in their faces when they looked at me at the government equipment he'd dismissed as elaborate props at the base commander who'd personally responded to this incident. "Everyone's treating her like she really outranks them," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. Colonel Hayes stepped closer, his eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision of someone who'd investigated security breaches for 3 decades. The scattered evidence file, the handcuffs on my wrists, the classified briefing still displayed on my laptop screen, the look of growing panic on Marcus's face. "Colonel Carter designed our entire counterintelligence protocol," Hayes said, his voice filling the room with quiet authority. "She's prevented 3 major security breaches in the past year alone, including a Chinese espionage attempt that could have compromised operations across the Pacific Theater." He paused, letting the weight of that information settle. "Last month, intelligence that Colonel Carter developed prevented a terrorist attack on a NATO base in Germany. 2 months ago, her analysis stopped a cyber attack on military communication networks. 3 months ago, her team identified and neutralized a spy ring operating out of a defense contractor. Through our front window, I could see more of our neighbors gathering, other military families who'd heard the commotion and come to investigate. But their faces didn't show surprise. They showed recognition, concern, respect. Mrs. Patterson, from next door, whose husband was a major in logistics, caught my mother's eye through the window and mouthed, "Is Zara okay?" Because they knew. The whole base knew who I was, what I did, why my office had special security features that other housing units didn't have. Captain Morrison from across the street, a pilot who'd flown missions in Afghanistan, stood with his arms crossed watching the CID vehicles, with the expression of someone who understood exactly how serious this situation was. Lieutenant Colonel Williams from down the block, an engineering officer who'd worked with my team on base security upgrades, was talking quietly on his phone, probably alerting his own chain of command about the incident. These were my neighbors, my colleagues, people who'd known for years that I wasn't just another officer. They'd seen the late-night emergency calls, the urgent departures for classified missions, the level of security that surrounded my work. To them, this wasn't a revelation. This was confirmation of what they'd always known. "Sir," Colonel Hayes continued, his attention returning to Marcus, "you've been living with one of the Army's most valuable intelligence officers. The woman you've accused of fraud has security clearance that I don't even have. She receives briefings from the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Marcus's carefully compiled evidence suddenly looked different. Those suspicious calls he'd recorded, they were Pentagon briefings about developing threats in Eastern Europe. Those contact lists with general names, those were real generals, my actual chain of command people, who depended on my analysis to make decisions that affected American lives. That expensive equipment he thought was fake government-issued gear worth more than his annual pension assigned, specifically because of the classified nature of my work. "I was protecting my family from a con artist," Marcus said, but his voice had lost all its earlier conviction. "I've seen stolen valor cases. I know the signs. Everything she did matched the pattern." "Sir," Colonel Hayes replied with cold precision, "you've just compromised operations protecting American soldiers overseas. You've interfered with classified briefings involving ongoing missions in Afghanistan. You've detained a federal officer during the performance of her duties." The magnitude of what he'd done was starting to sink in. This wasn't a local police matter anymore. This was federal. This was the kind of case that made national news and ended careers. CID Agent Williams arrived as Colonel Hayes was speaking, a 20-year veteran investigator who specialized in security breaches and espionage cases. Behind him came a full forensic team to assess what classified information might have been compromised. "Colonel Carter," Agent Williams said, approaching me with professional respect, "we need to secure this briefing and assess any potential intelligence compromise." "Are you injured?" "Negative," I replied, slipping back into military bearing despite the handcuffs. Briefing was suspended when the incident began. Classification protocols were maintained throughout. Agent Williams nodded to Rodriguez, who immediately unlocked my handcuffs. As circulation returned to my hands, I could see Marcus watching the interaction. the way Agent Williams addressed me as an equal, the way Rodriguez showed respect for my rank, the way everyone in the room treated me as exactly what I was. "Mr. Dawson?" Agent Williams said, turning to Marcus, "You're under federal investigation for interference with classified military operations. You have the right to remain silent." As Agent Williams read Marcus his rights, I watched my stepfather's face cycle through emotions: confusion, denial, dawning realization, and finally devastating understanding. For 30 years, he'd been the authority, the one who knew better, the one who solved cases and protected people. Now he was the suspect in a federal investigation, handcuffed in his own home, while the woman he'd tried to arrest was revealed as someone who outranked everyone in the room. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of procedures and protocols that Marcus had never encountered in 30 years of small-town police work. Criminal Investigation Division officers swarmed our house, transforming our quiet family home into an active crime scene. Agent Williams led a team of 6 federal investigators who specialized in espionage and security breaches. They photographed everything: Marcus's evidence file my office setup, the handcuffs he'd used, the laptop still displaying classified briefing materials. Every detail was documented with the precision of people who understood that national security cases leave no room for error. A separate security team swept my home office, led by Major Chen from Base Counterintelligence. They cataloged every piece of equipment, assessed what information might have been compromised, and evaluated whether ongoing operations had been affected by the breach. "Colonel Carter," Major Chen said as his team worked, "we're implementing Protocol 7 for your current briefings. Alternative communication channels are being established, and your cleared personnel are being notified of the security incident." Protocol 7 meant that every operation I'd been briefing on was now under security review. Teams across 3 continents would need to implement backup communication plans. Months of careful operational planning would need to be reassessed for potential compromise. The Pentagon briefing was immediately suspended, backup protocols activated, and alternative communication channels established for the ongoing operation in Afghanistan. General Franklin and his team implemented contingency plans that had been developed for exactly this kind of security breach. My mother sat in our kitchen watching federal agents transform her home into an active investigation site. CID technicians dusted for fingerprints. Counterintelligence specialists examined my computer equipment. Security personnel interviewed neighbors about what they'd observed over the past weeks. "Mrs. Carter," Agent Williams said, approaching her with professional courtesy, "we need to ask you some questions about your knowledge of your daughter's work and any observations you might have made about your husband's recent behavior." My mother, despite 30 years as a trauma nurse who'd dealt with police investigations and federal cases, looked overwhelmed. I knew she was in the Army. I knew she worked in intelligence. I thought it was routine. Agent Williams showed her photos from Marcus's evidence file, surveillance pictures of me leaving the house, transcripts of conversations he'd recorded, detailed logs of my daily activities. "Did you know your husband was conducting surveillance on your daughter?" "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he was suspicious about her work, but I thought he was just being protective." Through the kitchen window, she could see more evidence of the investigation's scope: additional CID vehicles, a mobile command unit, base security personnel interviewing neighbors. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute. This was a federal case with implications that reached far beyond our family. Marcus sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten family dinners for 8 years, where he'd told stories about his police career, where he'd dispensed advice about authority and respect and knowing your place in the world. Now he was handcuffed to that same chair, waiting to be transported to federal holding while investigators processed the crime scene. "Mr. Dawson," Agent Williams said, sitting across from him with a thick file folder, "you understand that interfering with classified military operations is a federal offense punishable by up to 10 years in prison." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. I thought she was lying. Everything seemed too sophisticated for supply logistics. The equipment, the calls, the secrecy, it looked exactly like the stolen valor cases I worked. What you witnessed, Agent Williams explained with patience, that came from years of dealing with civilians who'd stumbled into federal cases, was Colonel Carter conducting routine intelligence briefings. What you interpreted as suspicious behavior was operational security. What you thought was fraud was a 15-year career protecting American interests. Agent Williams opened the file and began showing Marcus documentation that proved my credentials. Security clearance records that required congressional approval. Mission reports with my name redacted, but my impact clearly documented. Commendations from the Secretary of Defense for operations that had saved American lives. Photos of me briefing general officers at the Pentagon. Citations for intelligence work that had prevented terrorist attacks. Awards for counterintelligence operations that most military officers would never see or understand. Marcus stared at it all, really looked at it, for the first time. His carefully constructed case against me crumbled as he saw the evidence of what I actually was. "She wasn't pretending to be important," he said, finally his voice hollow with understanding. "She was pretending to be ordinary." Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see more evidence of his mistake. Base security had cordoned off our housing unit. Neighbors, military families who knew exactly who I was, had gathered at a respectful distance. Some were offering to help my mother. Others were asking if they needed to implement their own security protocols. Colonel Peterson from Housing Management had arrived to assess whether other families needed to be relocated during the investigation. Captain Rodriguez from Base Communications was coordinating with Pentagon security about the compromised briefing. Major Thompson from Counterintelligence was interviewing neighbors about any suspicious activity they might have observed. This was the military community response to one of their own being attacked. Not chaos, but coordinated support. Not panic, but professional crisis management. "All these years," my mother whispered to me as the investigation continued around us, "when you said logistics paperwork." "Every business trip was a classified mission," I told her quietly, rubbing circulation back into my hands where the handcuffs had cut off blood flow. "Every late meeting was briefing generals on threats to American soldiers. Every time I deflected questions about work, I was protecting operations that save lives." She looked at my laptop now, surrounded by CID technicians who were securing the classified materials still displayed on screen, briefing slides about Taliban communication networks, threat assessments for American bases in Afghanistan, intelligence reports that had taken months to develop and could save hundreds of lives if properly implemented. "While he called you a paper pusher," she said, understanding finally dawning in her eyes, "you were receiving commendations from the Secretary of Defense." Through our window, we could see Marcus being placed in the back of a CID vehicle. Not roughly. The agents were professional, treating him with the courtesy due to any suspect who was cooperating with the investigation, but with the unmistakable finality of someone whose world had just changed forever. 30 years of local police work, a reputation built on being the smartest person in the room, an identity constructed around authority and control, all of it destroyed in the span of 4 hours by federal investigators who understood exactly what he'd done and why it mattered. But as I watched him being driven away toward what would likely be federal charges and prison time, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt exhausted, tired of the secrecy that had protected operations but isolated me from people I loved, tired of the compartmentalization that kept me safe but kept my family distant. "I couldn't tell you the truth because lives depended on operational security," I said to my mother, watching the CID vehicle disappear around the corner. "But I lost my family's trust protecting other people's families." She was quiet for a long moment, processing 15 years of carefully constructed misdirection, understanding for the first time why I'd always been so guarded about work, so careful about operational security, so reluctant to share details about my military career. "How do we fix this?" she asked finally, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd just watched her world be turned upside down. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we start with truth. As much truth as my clearance allows." Okay. 3 days later, I sat across from my mother in the base family services office, neutral ground specifically designed for difficult conversations between military families dealing with the unique stresses of classified service. The office was comfortable but official, with photos of military families on the walls and resources for spouses dealing with deployment stress, security clearance requirements, and the isolation that comes with classified work. Captain Morrison, our family readiness officer, had set up this meeting to help us navigate the aftermath of what the base was now calling the incident. Captain Morrison was a 20-year veteran who'd specialized in military family counseling. She'd helped families deal with combat deployments, classified assignments, and the unique challenges that came with military service. Her office walls were covered with photos from families she'd helped, certificates from training programs, and resources for every kind of military family crisis. "Mrs. Carter," Captain Morrison said to my mother, "what we're dealing with here isn't uncommon. Many military families struggle with the balance between operational security and family communication. What's unusual is the extent of the security breach and the federal investigation that resulted." My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, still processing everything that had happened. "I need to know who my daughter really is," she said simply, "within whatever limits her job requires." So I told her. Not everything. I couldn't tell her everything, but I told her what I could within the constraints of my security clearance and operational requirements. I told her about the bronze stars she'd never seen stored in a safety deposit box, because bringing them home would have raised questions I couldn't answer. 3 of them awarded for operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, where my intelligence work had directly saved American lives. I told her about the Defense Meritorious Service Medal I'd received for designing counterintelligence protocols that were now used across all military branches. About the Intelligence Excellence Award that came with a handshake from the Director of National Intelligence and a citation that would remain classified for 50 years. I told her about the missions to Germany where my team had identified and stopped a terrorist cell planning attacks on American military families, how we'd worked with German intelligence for 8 months, building cases and gathering evidence before coordinating raids that prevented what could have been dozens of casualties. I told her about the cyber defense protocols I'd designed that were now protecting American infrastructure from Chinese hackers, how my team had identified vulnerabilities in military communication networks and developed countermeasures that were now standard across all government systems. "When you were deployed to Iraq that year," she said slowly, piecing together memories with new information, "you told us you were managing supply convoys." "I was coordinating intelligence operations across 3 provinces," I corrected gently, leading teams that identified IED networks before they could kill American soldiers. The convoy management story was my cover for family communications. Her eyes filled with tears as she processed the scope of what I'd been hiding. "The phone calls where you sounded so tired, those were after missions where we'd prevented attacks, where intelligence I'd developed had saved American lives. I was exhausted because I'd spent 18-hour days coordinating operations across multiple time zones, but I was also proud because I knew that American soldiers would be coming home alive because of work my team had done." She was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what I'd been carrying alone for 15 years. "The business trips where you'd come back and seem distant, those were classified briefings at the Pentagon congressional testimony about threats to American interests, coordination meetings with allied intelligence services. I'd come back distant because I'd spent days discussing threats that could kill thousands of people, and I couldn't share any of it with the people I loved most." Captain Morrison had been quiet during our conversation, taking notes and occasionally offering tissues when the emotions became overwhelming. "I should have known," my mother said finally. "I should have seen past the cover story. I should have protected you from his doubt." "You couldn't have known. That was the point of operational security." I reached across the table for her hand. "But you could have trusted me. You could have believed that I was capable of more than he thought I was, even if you didn't know exactly what that more entailed." Her grip tightened on my fingers. "I did trust you. I just didn't trust myself to deserve a daughter that important." The words hit deeper than any tactical briefing I'd ever received, cutting through years of careful emotional compartmentalization to reach something I'd protected as carefully as any classified information. "Mom," I said gently, "I want a family that knows I serve something bigger than myself, even if you can't know all the details. Can we build that?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face for the first time since my father's funeral 15 years ago. "Your father would be so proud of who you became." And for the first time in 15 years, I believed her. Captain Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, we have resources for military families dealing with classification requirements, support groups for military spouses and family members, counseling services that specialize in operational security challenges, educational programs about what families can and cannot know about their loved one's military service." My mother looked at her gratefully. "I want to understand. I want to be the kind of family member she deserves." "That starts with trust," Captain Morrison said simply. "Trust that her service matters even when you can't know the details. Trust that her sacrifices protect people even when you can't see the results. Trust that her love for you is real, even when her work requires emotional distance." Over the next hour, Captain Morrison walked us through resources available to military families dealing with similar challenges, support groups where my mother could meet other family members of intelligence officers, educational materials about operational security that would help her understand why certain information couldn't be shared, counseling services that specialized in helping families rebuild relationships after security-related conflicts. As we left the Family Services office, my mother slipped her arm through mine, something she hadn't done since I was a teenager. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly as we walked across the base toward our housing unit. "I've always been proud of you. I just didn't know how proud I should be." 6 months later, Marcus sat in the base legal office for his final hearing, flanked by a public defender who specialized in federal cases. The charges had been reduced from espionage to interference with government operations. My recommendation communicated through official channels. Not mercy, justice tempered with understanding. The base legal office was stark and official, with American flags and military regulations posted on every wall. Judge Advocate Colonel Thompson, a 30-year legal officer who'd prosecuted everything from desertion to treason, presided over the proceeding with the kind of gravitas that federal charges deserved. The past 6 months had been devastating for Marcus. Federal charges do that to people, especially those who'd built their identity around being on the right side of the law. His retirement benefits were under review. His security clearance, permanently revoked, his reputation in the military community destroyed. "Mr. Dawson," Colonel Thompson said, reviewing the case file, "you've pleaded guilty to interference with federal operations and unlawful detention of a military officer. Before sentencing, do you have anything to say?" Marcus had aged in ways that went beyond simple time passage. The confidence that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by the hollow understanding of someone who'd discovered that their entire worldview had been wrong. "I genuinely believed she was committing stolen valor," he told Colonel Thompson, his voice carrying none of its old authority. "I applied 30 years of police experience to what I thought was the most sophisticated fraud I'd ever encountered." The evidence lay spread across the table between us. 15 years of my service records commendations. I'd never shown my family security clearances that required congressional approval, mission reports with my name redacted, but my impact clearly documented. Photos of me with generals at Pentagon briefings, citations for operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, awards for intelligence work that had saved American lives in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, classification levels that most military officers would never achieve. Marcus looked at it all, really looked at it, for the first time. "You weren't pretending to be important," he said to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were pretending to be ordinary." "I never needed your validation, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady but not unkind. "I needed your trust. I needed you to believe I was capable of serving something bigger than your understanding of what women could achieve." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photo of me receiving a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. I spent so many years needing to be the smartest person in the room that I couldn't see when actual expertise walked into my house, he said finally. I couldn't handle the idea that you'd surpassed anything I'd ever accomplished. Your sentence, Colonel Thompson announced, is 6 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent federal record. Additionally, your veteran benefits are suspended for 1 year and you're permanently banned from all military installations. Marcus accepted the sentence with resignation, but before leaving, he turned to me one final time. I need to rebuild who I am, he said, without needing to diminish others to feel important. I believed him. Not because I forgave him, forgiveness would take time, but because genuine growth requires acknowledging the full scope of damage you've caused. Today, I stand before a new class of officer candidate school students at Fort Benning, Georgia, sharing something I'd never been able to tell my own family for 15 years. The lecture hall holds 200 future military officers, men and women who've committed to serving something larger than themselves. Leadership isn't about controlling others' perceptions, I tell them. It's about serving something greater than personal recognition. It's about making decisions that protect people who will never know your name, solving problems that will never make headlines. My new assignment, Pentagon Liaison for Military Family Readiness Programs, helping families navigate the unique challenges of classified service. On my desk sits a photo from last month, my mother and me at my promotion ceremony to full colonel, the first time she'd seen my real uniform with all the decorations I'd earned in silence. She'd stood in the front row, tears streaming down her face, as a 3-star general pinned my new rank while reciting accomplishments that had previously been classified. For distinguished service in intelligence operations that prevented terrorist attacks and protected American lives, the general had said, for 15 years of exceptional service in the defense of American interests. After the ceremony, my mother had whispered, I finally understand why you couldn't tell me, and I understand why you had to serve. A hand raises in the lecture hall. Ma'am, what if our families don't believe we're capable of what we've been assigned to do? You don't need permission to serve with excellence, I tell her. You don't need approval to protect your country, and you definitely don't need validation from people who can't see past their own limitations. I pause, looking across the sea of young faces. Some people will try to handcuff your potential because they can't handle your power. They'll question your authority because it threatens their control. Another hand raises. How do we handle that, ma'am? You serve anyway, I say simply. You protect people who doubt you. You defend freedoms for those who question whether you deserve to defend them. The auditorium is completely silent now. The uniform doesn't make you important, I tell them, touching the colonel's eagle on my collar. The mission does. The service does. The willingness to carry burdens that others can't understand, that's what makes you important. Your families may never fully understand the scope of your service. Classification requirements mean some of your greatest achievements will remain secret forever, but that doesn't diminish their value. As I dismiss the class, my phone buzzes with a text from my mother. Saw the news about your family readiness program. So proud of who you've always been, even when I couldn't see it. Love you, Colonel Carter. For the first time in my career, perfect clarity and family love existed in the same moment. The handcuffs that once symbolized Marcus's attempt to control my potential now serve as a reminder that real power, the kind that protects nations and saves lives, can never be restrained by those who can't understand it. And somewhere tonight, a young officer is making decisions that will keep America safe, serving with excellence whether their family understands it or not. That's the real victory.